Common gaps organizations face when scaling accessible documents, where automation supports efficiencies and where human expertise is essential. And lastly, practical ways to build sustainable audit-ready workflows. So let me introduce you to the two folks you see on your screen. My name is Kristen Yokota. I've been in the accessibility industry for a little over a decade now, helping organizations, regardless of where they are in their accessibility journey, starting out or more mature. I originally started out at Compliance Sheriff, where I met my co-host today, Ken Nakata. I have worked for TPGI, and currently I'm the EVP of Sales here at Continual Engine, the creators of PREP, which stands for PDF Remediation Platform. So let me introduce my good friend, Ken Nakata, and a great resource for all of us today. He has more than 30 years of accessibility experience. He is a former senior trial attorney, disability rights for the Department of Justice, and a principal of Converge Accessibility. States, local municipalities, education, as well as corporations are under increasing pressure to make their public-facing documents accessible to all. But how can you achieve this at scale while balancing limited budgets and internal resources? The vast number of PDFs online presents a significant challenge in ensuring accessibility. Why? Accessibility is no longer a nice to have. Digital content is growing faster than teams can manually keep up. Regulations are clearer and enforcement is increasing. So, Ken, good morning, Ken. Great to see
Good
you.
morning.
Are Are there specific areas where states, corporate, or education are getting caught off guard?
Yeah, I think that a lot of organizations are thinking about accessibility as an all or nothing and trying to make accessibility so they can just wave a magic wand and trying to make everything accessible all at once. As you said, it's a journey and it's going to take time. And too often it's just thrown over the fence as a requirement to developers and creative content creators to just suddenly make accessible. And when you try to do something like that, when you try that all or nothing approach, it usually ends up in failure and frustration. So I'd say there isn't one specific technical requirement that everybody falls down on, but I would say that too often they just think that they can just throw these requirements over the fence and all of a sudden everything's going to become magically accessible.
And I think that's such a great point, Ken, because we don't want to boil the ocean. We know that this is a journey. And for the people who are on the call, I think it's important to note that this is going to take time. If you look back 10, 15 years when web accessibility became top of mind, organizations didn't automatically press a button and their websites were immediately accessible to all. It took time, it took commitment, it took pivoting, it took education. So I just want us all to breathe for a moment and say, this is not a surmountable task at hand. What we want to show is mindfulness and intent. So we will move forward. And again, please present any questions that you have in the chat. But moving on, understanding accessibility standards in theory is one thing, right? Applying them consistently across teams and documents is another, just like Ken was alluding to. Teams often struggle with how WCAG, PDF, and Title II apply together, especially when handling large volumes of PDFs in diverse formats. That said, Title II now references WCAG explicitly, PDF UA is becoming the expected standard for documents, and public entities face pressure from constituents, advocacy groups, and legal bodies. So, Ken, why
Mhm.
are PDFs such a common source of risks,
Oh,
regardless of industry?
yeah, that's easy to answer. It's because PDFs are so ubiquitous in along across governments and corporations. Everybody uses PDFs. It's like it's the common denominator. It's the lingua franca. It's what everybody uses as this common way of communicating information. And for good reason. It's because it replicates something that we're all familiar with, which is a paper document
Right.
with high fidelity. And it does a really great job at that.
Good point. It's the de facto standard in communicating. I think that's
Yes.
fair to say.
Yep.
So, as organizations increasingly face regulatory expectations tied to these three uh, laws, this session offers particular clarity on how these standards operate together in real workflows. So, why are folks struggling? I think it's fair to say that standards are complex and not written for practitioners or lay persons. Teams lack clarity on what good looks like, and manual remediation is slow and it's super expensive. So, Ken, what's the biggest barrier you see to consistent compliance? I'm just going to name a few. Um, is it a lack of tooling, senior level buy-in, a disparate approach, all of the above, others?
Oh, you pretty much named it right there, Kristen. You need all of those things are the cause of why teams struggle. And as I mentioned before, leadership doesn't really understand the nature of the struggle. The tools that we have are great, but well, the existing tools that people want to use, just the basic Adobe accessibility features and going through the tag tree is a bit of an arduous process. And it doesn't simplify the process in any great way. Uh, yeah, and then they don't necessarily know because the tools aren't it's easy to use, teams struggle on actually implementing it.
And I definitely think that the lack of senior level buy-in can really have a negative effect on the success of the folks who are committed to doing the right thing. And
Mhm.
the ones that I see who are exceeding, and I think you probably see this yourself, Ken, are the ones who do get leadership buy-in, and that it becomes a part of their religion, if you will, for that
Mhm.
particular company, that university, that municipality, or that state. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah. Well, leadership buy-in is you need to have leadership that's definitely bought in and supporting the mission, but leadership also has to understand that goal that you're after. And it's not WCAG perfection. You're not trying to make every PDF absolutely perfect and get it's a point of making sure that you get to that you recognize how the law fits in and how undue burden and things like that fit in, how effective communication fit in so that you're actually meeting the needs of people with disabilities. But they have to know that it's a risk and an achievable business goal, just like anything else that they face, just like
Well said,
privacy,
Ken.
security. Yeah.
I agree. And I think it's unfortunately something that has been lagging for quite some time, and now it's here to stay. So I think that's this knee-jerk reaction we're seeing in the market. I'm going to ask you a small favor if I can get my mouse to work. Can you give us a quick overview of WCAG, PDF, and Title II, and intersect and explain how they intersect, knowing that documents are predominantly leading or PDF UA and WCAG are pretty much aligned right now with the standardization. Can you kind of simplify it for everybody on the call today?
Yeah, I think so. So let's see if I could put it in the simplest way possible. Ultimately, you have to comply with the law. That's the gold standard. It's ADA Title II. Uh, then you've got these standards like WCAG and PDF, which are pretty much aligned. PDF UA is the PDF standard. It's basically a subset of WCAG 2.2.1, A and AA, which is the law incorporates. So those are the things that the law references. But the Justice Department and every practical advocate out there knows that those goals, that technical standard, it's vague, first of all. If you try to understand WCAG, it's really kind of hard unless you're a developer who's spent a lot of years in accessibility. It's hard to understand what WCAG is. And it's also kind of unachievable because so many things, it's just the nature of software. It just changes too fast. And so instead, what I guess the way to think about it is it's like you're trying it's a standard that's out there that they want you to keep striving for because technology changes, technology improves. They want you the law wants you to keep trying to go for that goal. And if you don't keep going for that goal, that's when you get into trouble. At the end of the day, though, the most important thing is making sure that you're providing your program services and activities. You're trying to make all the things accessible for people with disabilities. So even if you can't make that technology accessible, even if you can't make that PDF accessible, you still have to provide, you have to think about how you're going to provide that information for people with disabilities. And that can be something like a phone number or an email address, some non-technical, well, fairly low-tech solution. We're making sure that people can still access that stuff. That if you don't do both, if your technology is inaccessible and you don't provide a backup like that, that's where you're really going to get into trouble because you're just basically shutting out people with disabilities from accessing your services. So always think, I know I probably just confused things more than I simplified it, but think of it as WCAG is your technical goal. That's your thing you're trying to strive for. And that's what the law ultimately requires. And as long as you're trying to strive for that, that's where you're much in a much safer spot because that's where things like the undue burden defense comes in. That's where fundamental alteration comes in. Those defenses that are built into the law um, are there for a reason. It's basically saying do what you can practically do to achieve this goal of WCAG compliance or PDF UA compliance.
Understood. And I definitely concur with you. I'm just going to echo and repeat the need for everyone to offer an alternative way to communicate with your community members. I see this more often than not. You and I, well, I've been in it for over 10 years, but it's amazing how a lot of sites don't have an accessibility statement or an area where they can provide an email address with someone's name or phone number where somebody is challenged to receive the information that they need. So I think it's important for everybody to realize this is a small step that you can take that will really embrace your community members with disabilities. So it's something that doesn't cost a lot of money and it goes very far. So as we continue on, each industry obviously has its own challenges. I'm just going to speak to three core verticals: education, high volume, constant updates, right? With their courses, they're constantly changing and creating new content for obvious reasons. Government, public facing documents, thousands and thousands of them, and they have transparency requirements, correct? And then with corporations, they have millions of documents they need to support, and many times they're multilingual and they're much more complex than other verticals out there. So, Ken, what sector or industry do you think is struggling the most right now?
Um,
I have one to share.
okay. Well, right now I think your slides are like two slides behind, by the way. Um,
Well, they are.
yeah, right now this thing that's showing is accessibility
Oh,
standards overview.
I'm sorry.
Okay, there we go. Okay, perfect. Uh, Oh boy, each one of them have different have is freaking out right now. It's just that they're freaking out for different reasons. So they all have enormous challenges. Education probably, if I were to take a guess, I'd probably say it's education that has the biggest challenge, just because they have the least control and the least knowledge over all the different PDFs that they've got. Their professors are doing things like putting in last minute reading assignments in PDF that, are a reading assignment for the next day. And then after that passes, then the need goes away. Um, and, education is also it's just in general the Wild West. There's this, in the US especially, there's a culture that we should be leaving professors to do their own thing, and it's educational independence. But the consequence of that is that we're also not corralling professors to make sure that they're always doing the right thing. And a lot of them don't even think about accessible PDFs because, say, they're an engineering professor and they think, oh, I can't possibly have a blind student in my class. Well, yeah, you can. And um, and so they still have to make they still have to make all that stuff accessible. But yeah, I mean, government, they're freaking out because, the April 24th deadline is coming up rapidly. And then an enterprise, oh my gosh, I mean, the private sector produces so many PDFs. Um, uh, yeah, they produce billions of PDFs, and their challenge is enormous right now, especially since they think that that a lot of them are facing the avalanche of lawsuits that are out there. Because most of the lawsuits that are out there, 99% of them are all on the private sector, so it affects the last group the most.
Thank you for your insight, Ken.
So now you have to
So what are
reveal
some,
what did you
what?
think is the biggest? You mentioned that
I
the
was going
three
to
groups.
say state and local municipalities because of the deadline.
Okay,
Yeah, and they wait
fair
till
enough.
last minute, right? Unfortunately, or they can't, their budget, you know, strong held, or you know what I mean? They lack the money that they need or the commitment internally to gain buy-in to do it correctly. So that's what I was going to say.
Okay, fair
So
enough.
pivoting, we're going to dive into some of the biggest challenges that I personally hear on repeat, and there are four of them I'm going to mention. Manual tagging is repetitive and error prone. Alt text is often inaccurate or missing. Teams lack a way to preview accessibility from a user's perspective, meaning screen reader validation, right? And work and the last one is workflows are fragmented. So I suspect all of our attendees on this call are probably nodding their head in agreement. Um, so moving on, how can teams operationalize compliance? I see it as a three-pronged approach myself, Ken. I'm looking to get your opinion on this. So compliance at scale, I think this is very clear, requires automation and human expertise in some degree. They need to shift from reactive to proactive workflows. And I know that's a difficult one, but once you get it into your development cycle, your content creators, and you create this momentum, it becomes a little bit easier to do that. And then accessibility, to go and to add to that last one, accessibility must be embedded into creation and not bolted on later. So Ken, you are an expert at creating roadmaps for success for your clients. You do this every day. Can you discuss some of the key elements that you share with your clients that are attainable and instills continuity and ownership and consistency in their output? Can you just maybe give a sneak peek into some of the basics of your foundation that you build for your clients?
Yeah, I think that it's important for organizations to not think that they're not necessarily making every piece of content accessible. Because if I send an email to a colleague, for instance, I don't have to make sure that I check the color contrast of the fonts in the email if I know that the recipient doesn't have a disability, for instance. So there's a certain amount of common sense that goes into deciding which documents actually have to be made accessible. So the way in which we do it is you basically create a flow chart that's based upon, which documents do I realistically have to be made accessible? And then after that, it can become fairly complex depending upon the agency's risk tolerance and how the ADA exceptions fit in and whether you have backups and all of that. But eventually, what we ultimately create is when we created this for our clients, what we found out is that, the comms people say we can't give this to our staff because it becomes way too complicated. So then we create a so-called cross-functional flow chart that basically tells anybody who's creating a document if it's going out to the public, or it's going to a person with a disability, it's got to be made accessible. And then centralize the knowledge of who actually creates the PDFs. I don't think that, for instance, not everybody should be having a copy of prep and trying to make their PDFs accessible because that dilutes the knowledge and they're not going to do a good job at it. Right? You want to have a core group of people that are really the experts in PDF accessibility. But I think that that's a better way of doing it. And then those people then have a different level flow chart. Okay, how does risk factor into this, based upon all the things that we've agreed upon? And so once that becomes a understood process and it has to have buy-in from all the major people in the organization, then you just let the flow chart work. And then you start looking at, okay, what are the outcomes? Are there any groups that are being negatively affected by this? And if there are, that just means that means your flow chart's incorrect. But you want to get ahead of the process. That's why I think we mentioned this earlier. If you want to move it, as you hear a lot about this in the accessibility world about shifting left, you want to get earlier in the process. And so that means that it doesn't just become an afterthought. You know that this is something that's going to be coming up, but these are the kinds of factors that go into deciding which PDFs actually have to be made accessible and by whom.
Understood. And would part of your best practice when you're speaking to folks, do you embed training? Obviously, as a technology company, we provide training with every engagement, but it's not, even if you provide a series of trainings, I myself am constantly needing to refresh myself on skills and best practices. Um, do you also agree that having a training resource that is available ongoing, like a self-service library, if you will, especially for those content creators, do you think that helps move the needle forward to have something that folks can turn to as a
Oh, yeah,
resource?
absolutely. They definitely need that. Yeah, they say that only like 10% of training is actually retained if you just give a
Yeah.
live training. And so what the corollary of that is that you need to have refreshers. And that means there has to be something, either a crib sheet or a checklist or preferably a training video library that allows the people that are actually doing the job to go back in and refresh your recollection on a particular point. So if they're struggling with something like, how do I check reflow in this document? Or how do I make sure that that image has the right alt text? I forgot how to do it. And then if there's a resource that you can go to that says, oh yeah, to check your alt text, do this, then they can apply that learning in the thing that they're actually doing. And so the next time that they come across it, they probably won't struggle as much, or at least they'll know exactly where to go to.
Exactly. And again, we know this is a repetitive retraining of particular content creators, right? It's not this one and done. So the ability to have resources that people can turn to when they get stuck, I think, is a vital part of any program. So I'm glad you agree with me, Ken.
Hi, Kristen.
Yeah.
We have a question actually. Do you want to take it
Okay.
now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's an anonymous attendee actually. So the question goes like, will or does CE have a resource that explains what the April federal law requires? Their municipal clients are uncertain about exactly what they need to make accessible, and they need to guide them through this.
Can you repeat that? Because that was a long one.
Yeah, so the person is asking that does Continual Engine have a resource that explains what the April federal law requires?
If we have a resource that the law requires. I don't know if we
You mean
do. I'd have to table that, but Ken might.
Um, yeah, so I guess the question is, they want to know they want to know which documents have to be made accessible, it sounds like.
Oh,
And
okay.
is that what you
That would be public. If that's the case, and just a broad brush approach, that would be any public facing document that is accessible to, if this was a state or a municipality asking the question to Banco, that would be first and foremost. Um, was it a state or local
Yeah,
municipality
it
that
was a
was asking?
municipality client actually. It was for a
Okay,
municipality client. Yeah.
so you would want to make sure that every document that is available to your community members in your state or county is accessible. That's first and foremost. And then if you don't have an alternative method for your community member, who might be a screen reader, to communicate with you, I would definitely propose that you offer that out as an alternative mechanism to communicate if they're having a problem, let's say, with a document that they've come in contact with that is inaccessible. So keep in mind, you want to have a phone number, you want to have an email address, you want to make that information available throughout your website, not hidden someplace, where it's hard to find. You want to provide that information as well. Um, and Debanka, we can regroup
Kristen,
with
there
the
is a
anonymous.
add on to this. I just wanted to jump in. It says, I'm concerned that the impending April 2026 deadline, combined with the lack of a standardized statewide remediation tool, will lead to the mass deletion of public documents as a stopgap measure for compliance. It is quite
Mhm.
possible there will be a mass wasting of state agency funds on disparate programs and of varying quality to try to hurry up and get compliant. I'm not understanding why a centralized state level purchase order for a trusted accessibility platform slash program and an updated and accurate resource guide is not a priority or in the sights of DAS. A unified tool set will allow for a more efficient, high quality transaction to WCAG 2.1 AA standards across all state agencies. And this is also anonymous. And the next question is, what do I have to do to make PDFs accessible? Where can I find a list of requirements written for a layman?
So Ken, you and I have talked about
Mhm.
some organizations just taking all of their documents offline. Now
Mhm.
that is a really bad decision because you know what you're doing, folks? You are creating a barrier for your community members, and that is not a path forward, right? That is a band-aid where you're protecting yourself, but you're not serving your community. So I would definitely strongly suggest you do not do that. In regard, Ken, you can add or chime in with that one.
Yeah, it's happening. It's happened too. In Colorado, for instance, their accessibility law required WCAG compliance 2 years ahead of everybody else. So we've actually seen this happen, where local governments have just taken down their websites because they freaked out over, their state law requirements. That's not the right approach. It's not. These digital accessibility laws have never had that as an intended consequence. And it really comes down to planning. Um, Both the Colorado law and the ADA law, they say you've got to achieve WCAG compliance unless doing so constitutes an undue burden or a fundamental alteration. So you basically, what that means is you just have to document the fact that it really is a big burden, that it does constitute a fundamental alteration or an undue burden. And so if you have a plan and you're sticking to your plan, things that go beyond that plan would, you have a good case of saying it's an undue burden because, you didn't have the resources for it. You have to uproot your plan that you've already got in place. As long as you've got that plan and you're making meaningful progress in achieving that plan, that's really what the laws, both laws ultimately require. And a regulator that comes in is probably not going to be second guessing you on your minute decisions. And let's face it, I mean, in the ADA Title II, even if they did, you're not, no one's entitled to monetary damages. So the only thing that would happen is the Justice Department, if they did investigate, you would say, oh, you violated the law. Don't do it again. Fix it. And then that's part of, their remedies and they'll go away.
Okay, I don't know if we hit on all three questions, and I apologize, but we'll follow up via email if we missed some of the other context that was shared earlier.
Also,
Uh,
yeah, I'll also add that there are states have been rather slow in centralizing their resources on PDF remediation and web accessibility, but that's changing. So actually, I think the people that should be doing this are the national organizations that are the like NASIO and national leagues of cities and things like that. Those organizations should also be centralizing some resources nationwide because not every state is the same. Some states have more resources than other states. And they should be doing things like entering cooperative purchasing agreements to make it easier to get the tools that local governments need in order to achieve accessibility. So that I definitely agree with. I definitely echo the point of um, the comment from the commenter about that.
And
Thank
Ken,
you,
there are a
Ken.
few more comments, and I'm wondering if we want to go through all of them very quickly in the same thread. So it's one that says from Yosef Schiff, not all docs have to comply. There are exceptions for archived content and pre-existing
Right.
conventional electronic documents. The latter are PDFs, Word docs, presentations, and spreadsheets that already are available. Those are exempted from the compliance requirement under 28 CFR 35.201.
Yep. Yes, they are. I think there are five exceptions. Basically, you really want to think about it in terms of what are the documents that are being used to deliver the program services or activities of a local government. If you have a form, for instance, that you use to apply for a service, or you have a PDF that explains what the current activity or program that you're offering is as a local government, you're going to want to make that accessible. Um, and the things that are you have on your website that are pre-existing, that are not necessarily part of a current program, yeah, those documents are exempted from coverage under point 201 of the regulations. So if you want to find these things, the place to go is ada.gov. That's the Justice Department's, the Disability Rights Section's official ADA website, ada.gov. And you look for the Title II regulations, and that's under a pull-down menu. And then on the left side, you'll see a menu bar that lists all the different sections. And then you want to go to subpart H, which is the web accessibility rule. And that's all the new things that came out with the new regulation. Um, and so yeah, those are the new requirements that everybody's now really worried about. But it also is a good idea to just generally breeze through the rest of the Title II regulation because it's important to remember that the new web regulation is really just a part of the overall requirements under Title II. And that's why when Kristen was saying earlier that um, yeah, you have to make sure that you provide an alternate means of access and you're trying to make your programs accessible in general, like with a telephone number and an accessibility statement. That's that really is getting to the overall goals of the Title II regulation. There's nothing in there that says you have to have an accessibility statement, for instance, but that's a darn good idea for making your programs accessible to comply with the overall Title II requirements. Um, was there anything else, VJ?
Another question, VJ?
Yes, there are more, but I'm just wondering, in the interest of continuing with what you have in mind, do we want to circle back to these or maybe even send them
We have
out as,
time. We're
yeah,
almost at
we
the
can.
end, so I'd say
Okay,
let's do it while it's top of mind.
let's do it. Okay, so there are some comments I'm going to read before we move to the question. I think there was Alan who said, I don't think that's true. And that was with the previous comment that I shared. There's another anonymous comment that says, keep in mind that claiming fundamental alteration requires a robust examination of the process and undue financial burden looks at the institution as a whole, not just the department.
Mhm.
And then I'm just going to read a couple more, and then Ken, you can jump in, and Kristen, you as well. Be aware of 28 CFR 35 5.201B for pre-existing conventional electronic documents like PDF, Word, Excel. And then anonymous attendee with a question, where can we find the WCAG requirements that aren't applicable for PDF or the guidance to meet the criteria? Example, text spacing.
Wow. So that would uh, when you try to, I think that's a little bit of a difficult question. So the requirements for WCAG don't apply perfectly to PDF. And I think that PDF UA was really an attempt to try to come up with the requirements under WCAG that do apply to PDFs. And it's not a perfect match. So, and I don't know whether anybody's got a nice succinct list of the WCAG requirements that aren't applicable to PDFs. It would be an interesting exercise, though. I think that maybe the W3C has that. But yeah, that's the best answer I can give.
Any
Okay,
other questions, VJ?
one last one from Shide C. How does this apply to the publisher of higher education textbook materials? A publisher that is not one of the big five and whose budget is limited. Does this pre-existing document hold fast for student and instructor resource documents like Word, Excel, etc.? We already create accessible PowerPoints.
Huh. Okay. Could you repeat that, VJ?
Sure. Yeah. How does this apply to the publisher of higher education textbook materials? This is a publisher that is not one of the big five and whose budget is limited. Does this pre-existing document hold fast for student and instructor resource documents like Word, Excel, etc.? And this person says we already create accessible PowerPoints.
Okay. So if you're a publisher, you're not subject to the Title II regulation because you're not a Title II entity, but your customers are. And so your customers will be asking for the accessible content. And so it's really a matter of you're not going to get sued under Title II, but you're going to lose business. Although it depends on the contract that you have with your Title II, with the Title II educational entity. They may require that, they may have an indemnification clause, for instance, in which case you would be liable, but that's under the contract. That's not what the law requires. It's what the contract requires. For the pre-existing material that you've got, or say instructor materials, if that's being used as part of a current educational program, yeah, then that educational institution needs to make sure that even that pre-existing content is accessible. The pre-existing document exception, pre-existing conventional electronic document exception, um, applies for things that are pre-existing, so they're created before the effective date, and that that are not being used as a current that are not being used to access a current program, service, or activity. So, yeah, it's but if they are being used as part of a current program, service, or activity, then yeah, then the exception doesn't apply.
And I would
Great.
think if this would be a competitive advantage, right? If you, as a publisher, are committed to accessibility, that's how you stand out from the rest because that's a commodity, right? That's a commodity vertical. There's so many out there. So how do you stick out from the pack? You say that everything that we create is accessible, and then that gets you to the top of the list, in my opinion. VJ, can we move on? And then
Yes. We are
move?
done with the
Okay.
questions. I want to just read one last comment to make sure this is referenced. The VPAT has noted which guidelines apply or don't apply to documents. And that was not a question, but more a sharing. And with that, Kristen, go ahead with your plan.
Okay, thank you, BJ. Very good. Very
Thanks,
good
TJ.
job. Thank you. Okay, achieving compliance. There are three caveats to achieving compliance, and they encompass efficiency, right? Because the quicker we can be, the better we can create more accessible content, accuracy of that accessible content, and then workflow integration. So, Ken, with your consulting experience, what differentiates teams that succeed from those that struggle when it relates to some of the things I just talked about? And you probably, I think you've already stated them, but it might be worth repeating. What sets organizations apart from those who are excelling and achieving compliance versus those who are not?
Baseline processes again and again. That's the thing that I think really separates the leaders from the followers. You can too many organizations in general try to achieve these best practices without having the fundamental foundation in place. And the easiest way to achieve that is to have an agreement about what the processes look like for, which documents have to be made accessible and what group it goes to when it has to be made accessible. Once you achieve that, and everybody and you've got the process moving smoothly and you've ironed out all the kinks, then you can start doing things like achieving. That's when you started going and reaching for achieving best practices. But the processes, in my opinion, they create a real cultural shift, because if you don't do that, what happens is that accessibility becomes a bottleneck because somebody says, hey, you can't publish that document, or you can't buy that web-based application because it's inaccessible. And then it slows down the process. And then people start vilifying accessibility, saying, oh my God, this accessibility, it's impossible to figure out. It's always a last minute thing that we've got to fill in. Oh, I hate dealing with this stuff. And that creates a
Yeah.
culture where accessibility just won't thrive. But if you create the processes up front and everybody knows about them, then and you know that the processes are practical because you got buy-in from everybody that is a stakeholder in this, then yeah, then I think that's when you can start creating a real cultural shift and accessibility becomes easy.
Thank you, Ken. Okay. Now I can't move my. Okay. Sorry, I was having problems with my mouse. Okay, let's discuss best practices. I think we kind of have throughout this conversation today, but one critical step, I think, and one we haven't discussed when it relates to documents, is to templatize whenever possible. Ken, I know you're passionate about templatizing as well. The reason for that, and this can be for static or dynamic documents, right? Static would static template would be predominantly just text. It could be a form of some sort. It could be minute notes. It could dynamic could be a budget book that is published every quarter. The foundation of the document predominantly stays the same, but there might be more paragraphs or more graphs in another iteration. But the goal and the value of templatizing, the point that I'm trying to make here, is it saves that iterative work. Would you agree, Ken?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another best practice is to integrate accessibility into daily workflows. You've been echoing this all day, Ken. It can't be said enough. The need to incorporate automation for large volumes, I think, is pretty transparent and clear in its value. Conducting audits for continual improvement, or the ability to identify folks or groups that are lagging and not penalize them, but to have some kind of oversight and say, hey, guys, I see that you might be struggling. Can I provide you some additional resources? We can take a step back. So I think being engaged and not waiting for the wheels to fall off the bus is very important as well. And training, right? Training, I can't say it enough, Ken, and you say this consistently to your clients. I think anyone, when you're entering into something new that's being asked of you, to provide a resource that they can turn to whenever they get stuck. As you said, we have short attention spans. It's always useful to be able to go back to a resource that's available to you that is simple, right? It's not going to lament. It's short and sweet and gets to the point and provides real critical guidance. Would you agree, Ken?
Yeah, you absolutely have to have that kind of resource because people forget things. I forget.
Yes.
I'm now that I'm getting older, I'm forgetting things all the time. So something I can really relate to.
And if you go on vacation, right, you're so used to being in your element, and then you check out, and then all of a sudden you come back to work and you have this brain fog, and you were doing great but you took a time out. So it's always good to have information. I think knowledge is power, so the ability for us to empower our teams, our colleagues, with information so they can do the right thing is critical to success. Okay, I'm having problems with this again. Okay, this is an important point after Ken did his little acting about when people are like, oh, accessibility. Oh, it's so painful. Why do I have to be a part of this? We all benefit from accessible documents. Why? Because accessibility improves usability for all of us. It's similar to websites. When WCAG came around for digital content, we saw an evolution of web content that wasn't so busy. It was more clear and concise and easier to navigate. So again, the same thing with document accessibility. Tagged PDFs improve navigation, searchability, and readability for all of us. Accessible documents also support CO and digital reach. Ken, how
Hmm.
does accessibility tie into a broader digital strategy? Obviously, documents are an element of your digital footprint, but
Uh, how do-
how does it correlate to the broader digital strategy of organizations? We've talked about it previously on the
oh,
call.
you mean things like how should it align with things like your privacy and security initiatives, or how does digital accessibility help with your overall accessibility initiatives?
Well, I think, how does accessibility tie into a broader digital strategy? Meaning people are looking
Hmm.
at, oh, their web content's one thing, it's siloed. Our documents are siloed, meaning they're thinking this process, but how can we look at it more holistically as a strategy versus one element of the business versus another?
Well, yeah, and as we're creating roadmaps for different organizations, we find that actually making sure that your websites are accessible requires a different process from trying to make sure that your documents are accessible. So there's a distinction there. The In terms of what organizations should do, but I think that, you have to have that roadmap in the very beginning because you need that higher level process in place to set the goalposts, if you will, of what an organization is trying to achieve. And so, for instance, if you're talking about, say, web applications, what are the things that we're going to do to make sure that all of our different, the 3 dozen web applications and the CMS system that we use are going to get to a point where we can get all that stuff accessible. And it's not just throwing WCAG over the fence. And it's a bit of a different process from saying, oh, now we've got over 1,000 PDFs and they're all inaccessible because we've never looked at them. How are we going to make sure that we're actually complying with the law and making those accessible? And it is a bit of a different process. Like with the documents, it's really a matter of figuring out which ones we're actually currently using and figuring out what we're going to do with all the rest of the documents. And you don't go through that same process for web applications. For web applications, it's a different thought process. Instead, you're looking there at like, oh, well, what are the use cases for these? What do people actually use those applications for? What are the use cases? Doing limited testing on those, going back to the vendor who created those applications, figuring out when they're going to fix them, testing them when they come back. So it's a bit of a different process, right? But the thing is
Absolutely.
that the things that you do for web applications pretty much are all the same. The things that you do for PDFs are kind of all the same. This triage process and then remediating the rest. Um, that It's important though that the roadmap establish those kinds of categories of things. And for me, the big categories are existing web applications, existing PDF documents, new PDF documents, and new web applications. So it's new and old web applications and PDFs. So it's four different quadrants of a diagram. And each of those categories uses a different process, and the roadmap should outline that process. And then it should also say, okay, how are we going to train people now that we know that we're doing that stuff? Because once you got those four categories, you can figure out who's being affected by that. And so now you know the audience of people we have to train. And so then you build the training, layer the training on top of that. And then the roadmap should also include things like, who's going to steer this whole big ship? Probably the IT department. Generally, it works best if accessibility is done to we found, but if generally it's best if accessibility is led by the IT department.
I've seen that too. The most
Yeah,
successful ones are now being led by IT. I agree with that.
yeah. So it's that kind but the important point, I guess, that the common theme again and again for me is you have to have that roadmap of the different categories. And how you're going to address each category. At the same time, I talk about a roadmap, and I think a roadmap actually should be a public document. I think it's something that you should link to from your accessibility statement because it offers transparency and it shows to people in the public that you're actually serious about accessibility and, helps them understand why everything magically isn't accessible all at once. So it's a good thing to put out I think, to provide a link to your roadmap. But having said that, there's a difference between a roadmap and your actual implementation documents. So your roadmap shouldn't say, oh, we've got 20 applications on our website, and these are the three that we're focusing on this year. And next year we'll focus on these three. And next year no, don't do that. The only thing that does is it just gives a roadmap to a plaintiff who's saying, well, why are you waiting on that? Why are you waiting on this application till year three? I want it on year one. And so they'll end up suing you over it. So the internal implementation documents on, what you're specifically doing for each specific application or each specific PDF, don't make that public.
Well, I think it's fair to say as we're wrapping up that this is a this is a challenge that is fluid, knowing that we're constantly creating new content documents specifically for our customers, our students, our community members, that this isn't going to go away. So our goal today was to have an open dialogue, share some best practices, answer your questions. We are at the end of the conversation that we had planned for you today. So VG, I don't know if there are any outstanding questions or comments that the attendees have shared, but we want
No,
to,
nothing,
we
nothing.
hope,
Yep,
nothing?
it's all good, all clear.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. We hope the time was well spent, everyone, and we're all in this together. So remember, little steps go a long way, and we thank you for your commitment to making your documents accessible. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Ken. Bye,
Oh, thanks,
everyone.
Kristen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.